The silence in their Maple Creek home was a carefully curated thing. It was the silence of polished hardwood floors, of triple-paned windows that muted the sounds of children playing on the cul-de-sac, of a life so meticulously planned that it left no room for noisy intrusions. For Olivia Russo, this silence had once felt like an achievement, the serene backdrop to the American dream she and Michael had built. Now it often felt like a vacuum, sucking the air from her lungs. Their house, a modern two-story with a facade of gray stone and cedar, was Michael's masterpiece. As an architect on the fast track to a partnership at a prestigious Chicago firm, he had designed it himself. Every line was clean, every space intentional. It was a house for a magazine, and sometimes Olivia felt like she was just one of its tasteful, strategically placed accessories. A soft-hued throw pillow on the minimalist sofa, a delicate orchid on the quartz countertop. Pretty, but silent. Michael was a good man. This was a fact Olivia held onto like a handrail on a crumbling staircase. He was kind, driven, and he provided for them in a way that drew envious sighs from other couples in their circle. He worked punishing hours, returning home long after the sun had set, his mind still tracing blueprints in the air. Their conversations had become a shorthand of logistics. Did you call the landscaper? The Martins confirmed for Saturday? I'll be late tomorrow, don't wait up. He loved her, she knew, in the way one loves a foundational part of their life. He just didn't seem to see her anymore. Her own ambitions, once vibrant, had faded to a watercolor wash. She had been a promising graphic designer with a portfolio full of bold, expressive art. But the demands of supporting Michael's career, of managing their pristine home and social calendar, had sanded down her edges. Her part-time freelance work was for corporate clients who wanted logos that were friendly but professional, a description that felt like a summary of her own life. The easel in the spare bedroom, a gift from Michael years ago, stood draped in a dusty sheet, a silent monument to a different version of herself. The loneliness was a low-grade fever, a constant, quiet hum beneath the surface of her placid life. It was there in the long afternoons when the only sound was the refrigerator cycling on and off. It was there at neighborhood potlucks, where she would smile and nod while conversations about school districts and vacation homes swirled around her, feeling as if she were watching it all from behind a pane of glass. On a humid Tuesday in late July, the glass shattered. The call came from an unfamiliar number. A calm, professional voice on the other end delivered the news with practiced detachment. There had been an accident on the interstate. A semi-truck had jackknifed in the rain. Michael's car? He was at North Shore General. He was alive, the voice said, but it was serious. Olivia stood in the immaculate kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear, and watched a drop of condensation roll down a glass of iced tea she'd just poured for herself. The world seemed to slow, the quiet hum of the refrigerator suddenly roaring in her ears. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She simply hung up the phone, walked to the front closet, and took out her car keys, her movements as precise and robotic as a machine. The silence of the house rushed in behind her as she closed the door, no longer serene, but predatory. The hospital was a world unto itself, a sterile planet with its own sun, the relentless fluorescent lights, and its own language, a torrent of acronyms and medical jargon that flowed around Olivia without penetrating the fog of her shock. Michael was in the ICU. He had multiple fractures, femur, ribs, clavicle, and a traumatic brain injury. The doctors spoke in terms of monitoring the pressure and waiting for the swelling to go down. They were cautiously optimistic, a phrase that offered no comfort at all. Olivia's life contracted to the four walls of the waiting room and the small, crowded space beside Michael's bed. Her days became a blur of beeping machines, the hiss of the ventilator, and the antiseptic smell that clung to her clothes and hair. She slept in snatches on a vinyl chair that was perpetually cold, her neck stiff, her body a knot of anxiety. Friends and neighbors from Maple Creek came in waves during the first week. They brought casseroles she couldn't eat and offered platitudes that felt like stones pelting her already bruised spirit. "He's a fighter. You have to be strong for him. Let us know if you need anything." Jessica, Michael's sister, appointed herself as the family liaison, her well-meaning but overbearing presence adding another layer of pressure. She would pat Olivia's hand and say, "You just focus on being here, Liv. That's your job now." Olivia would nod, the word job echoing in the hollow space inside her. After the second week, the visits dwindled. The crisis became a routine. Life, for everyone else, went on. But Olivia was stuck in this timeless limbo, a ghost haunting the corridors of North Shore General. The loneliness she had felt in her quiet house was nothing compared to this. This was an isolation so profound, it felt like a physical drowning. She was Michael's wife, a role defined entirely by his prone, silent form in the hospital bed. Olivia, the person, had ceased to exist. She took to spending brief moments in the hospital's garden courtyard, a small, sad patch of green enclosed by brick walls. It was damp and shaded, with a few struggling rose bushes and a concrete bench. It was there, during the third week of her vigil, that she met Ethan. He was sitting on the bench, staring at a wilting petunia with an intensity she recognized. He had kind, tired eyes and a stillness about him that was a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the hospital. "Tough-looking flower," he said, his voice soft, not demanding a response. "It's trying," Olivia replied, surprised to hear her own voice, raspy from disuse. She sat on the other end of the bench. Silence stretched between them, but unlike the vacuum-like silence of her home, this one was comfortable, companionable. "My dad's in palliative care," he said after a while, as if they were continuing a long-standing conversation. "Third floor, lung cancer." "My husband," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the main building, "car accident, ICU." And that was it. They had exchanged their credentials for entry into this shared world of sorrow. His name was Ethan Cole. He was a landscape architect, which explained his focus on the sad little flower. He came every day to sit with his father, to read to him, to simply be present as he faded. Their meetings in the courtyard became a ritual. They rarely talked about the specifics of their situations. Instead, they talked about everything else. He asked about the book she was pretending to read. She asked about his work, and his face lit up as he described designing spaces that made people feel at peace. He looked at her, really looked at her, his gaze direct and inquisitive. One afternoon, he asked, "What did you do before all this?" The question caught her off guard. Not "what do you do," but "what did you do?" "I was a graphic designer," she said, the past tense hanging in the air. "I'd love to see it sometime," he said, and the simple, genuine interest felt like a key turning in a long, rusted lock. They started meeting for coffee at the Daily Grind across the street. The 10-minute escape felt like a gasp of fresh air after being underwater. In the warmth of the coffee shop, surrounded by the smell of roasted beans and the low murmur of other people's normal lives, Olivia felt a flicker of her old self. With Ethan, she wasn't just Michael's wife. She was Olivia. She could talk about her abandoned art, her frustration with corporate logos, her feeling of being a ghost in her own life. He listened. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes. He just listened and understood. He was the first person in years who had asked her not what Michael needed or what the house needed, but what she needed. The question itself was so foreign, so overwhelming, she couldn't answer. But the asking of it was enough. It was water on parched earth. The emotional affair began so subtly she didn't even recognize it. It was in a shared look of understanding over their coffee cups. It was in the way he'd gently touch her arm to get her attention. It was a lifeline of human connection in an ocean of clinical detachment. She knew, on some level, that it was dangerous. A voice in the back of her mind, the one that sounded like the polished expectations of Maple Creek, screamed warnings. But another, more desperate voice whispered that this was keeping her alive. The turning point came on a sweltering August night. The doctors had just performed another procedure on Michael. It had gone well, they said, but his recovery would be a marathon, not a sprint. The thought of more months, possibly years, of this life stretched before her like an infinite, sterile hallway. Overwhelmed, she fled to the courtyard. It was empty, the air thick and heavy. A summer thunderstorm was brewing, the sky a bruised purple. She found herself dialing Ethan's number without thinking. He answered on the first ring. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with immediate concern. "No," she whispered, the single word cracking open the dam of her composure. "Stay there. I'm coming." He wasn't at the hospital that evening, but he lived only 15 minutes away. When he arrived, the first drops of rain had begun to fall, fat and warm. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, at the raw despair on her face, and opened his arms. She fell into them, and the sobs she had been holding back for weeks finally broke free, convulsive and ugly. He just held her, his hand stroking her back as the sky opened up and drenched them both. He led her to his car, the rain plastering her hair to her face, her thin hospital visitor sweater soaked through. In the quiet, steamed-up interior of his car, the world outside blurred into a watercolor of running lights. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the dashboard's soft glow. He saw the shame, the exhaustion, the utter desolation in her eyes. What happened next was not a conscious decision. It was a gravitational pull, an inevitable consequence of two lonely souls colliding in a storm. It was a desperate, feverish attempt to feel something, anything, other than the cold dread of the hospital and the crushing weight of her life. It was a moment of profound and reckless escape. And as it happened, all Olivia could think was that for the first time in a month, she wasn't thinking about Michael at all. The moment the fever broke, the guilt crashed in. It was a cold, physical thing, a sickness that settled deep in her stomach. Driving back to the hospital later that night, the world seemed sharper, uglier. The fluorescent lights of the parking garage were accusatory. The antiseptic smell was the stench of her own deceit. She had crossed a line, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she could never go back. In September, the oppressive humidity of summer finally broke, replaced by the crisp, clean air of autumn. The change in season mirrored a change in Michael's condition. He was moved out of the ICU and into a rehabilitation wing. He was awake, lucid, his memory slowly returning in fragmented pieces. His body was a roadmap of his trauma, a latticework of scars, a leg in a complex metal brace, but he was Michael again. His recovery should have been unadulterated joy for Olivia. It should have been the light at the end of the tunnel. Instead, every step he took toward healing was a step she took deeper into her own private hell. Her betrayal was a constant, foul taste in her mouth. She had ended things with Ethan the morning after the storm, in a stilted, painful phone call. He had been quiet, understanding. "Take care of yourself, Olivia," was all he said, his voice heavy with a resignation that only made her feel worse. She had used his kindness, his empathy, as a balm for her own wounds, and in doing so, had created a wound far deeper and more septic within herself. Now, her time with Michael was an exercise in exquisite torture. His trust in her was absolute, a pure, unwavering beam of light that she felt utterly unworthy of. When he would struggle through a painful physical therapy session, his eyes would seek hers in the crowd of therapists and nurses, and he would give her a small, pained smile. "Doing it for us, Liv," he'd murmur later, exhausted. Each smile, each term of endearment was a fresh turn of the knife. She played the part of the devoted wife with an Oscar-worthy performance. She coordinated with doctors, managed insurance paperwork, and decorated his hospital room with photos from their life, a life that now felt like a fiction she had co-authored. She would read to him, not the thrillers he loved, but poetry, the words of others a shield for her own inability to speak from the heart. Her friend Chloe, visiting from Chicago, saw through the facade. They sat in the hospital cafeteria, a place Olivia now knew with grim familiarity. "You look haunted, Liv," Chloe said, her lawyerly gaze missing nothing. "And not just my husband was in a horrific accident haunted, this is something else." Olivia just stirred her coffee, the spoon clinking against the ceramic. "I'm just tired." "Bullshit," Chloe said, not unkindly. "You're a bad liar. Talk to me." And so, in a low, halting whisper, Olivia confessed. She didn't spare herself, detailing the loneliness, the desperation, the brief, cataclysmic escape with Ethan, and the all-consuming guilt that followed. Chloe listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Olivia finished, her voice a raw whisper, Chloe was silent for a long moment. Olivia braced for judgment, for disgust. "Okay," Chloe said finally, her voice even. "So you're human. You were in an impossible situation. You felt completely alone, and you made a massive, messy mistake. It doesn't make you a monster." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes. "But it feels monstrous, Chloe. He's lying in that bed, fighting his way back to me, and I did this. He looks at me like I'm a saint." "That's the part you have to figure out," Chloe said, her pragmatism a firm, grounding force. "This isn't about the other guy. He was a symptom. This is about you and Michael and whatever was going on long before that truck ever jackknifed." The day Michael was discharged felt like a national holiday to everyone but Olivia. Jessica had decorated the house with "Welcome home." Neighbors waved from their lawns as she carefully drove him up the driveway. The house, her beautiful, silent house, waited for them. As she helped him out of the car, his arm heavy around her shoulder, his gait slow and unsteady, a wave of dizziness washed over her. This was the moment she was supposed to have dreamed of for months, but stepping across the threshold felt like entering a tomb. The house was exactly as they had left it, yet everything was different. The minimalist furniture seemed cold and unwelcoming. The family photos on the mantelpiece felt like portraits of strangers. The air was thick with unspoken things. Michael, blissfully unaware, sank into his favorite armchair with a sigh of relief. "Home," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked around the room, his eyes misty. "God, I missed this. I missed you." That night, Olivia helped him get ready for bed. The process was slow and clinical, a routine of pills and braces and careful movements. She avoided looking at his scars, not because they were gruesome, but because they were a testament to his suffering, a suffering she had compounded with her own betrayal. She lay beside him in their king-sized bed, a chasm of cool sheets between them. The house was silent, but it was not the serene silence of before. It was a tense, humming silence, pregnant with her secret. Michael, exhausted, fell asleep quickly, his breathing deep and even. Olivia lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding a frantic, guilty rhythm against her ribs. She felt like an imposter in her own bed, in her own life. A few days later, things had settled into a new, fragile normal. Olivia was a full-time caregiver, her life a schedule of medications, appointments, and gentle encouragement. Michael was patient, grateful, and more emotionally present than he had been in years. His brush with death had stripped away the non-essential, and he was focused solely on his recovery and on her. One evening, they were sitting in the living room. A cool autumn breeze drifted through an open window. Michael had been quiet for a while, watching her as she pretended to read a magazine. "You seem a million miles away, Liv," he said softly. His voice was gentle, full of concern. It wasn't an accusation, but the words landed like a physical blow. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His hand was warm, his grip still strong. He looked into her eyes, his own filled with a deep, trusting love. "We'll get through this, right, Liv?" he asked, his voice a hopeful whisper. "We're okay?" The question, so simple, so innocent, so full of a reality that was entirely his and not hers, was the thing that broke her. The carefully constructed dam of her composure, already fractured, shattered into 1,000 pieces. A strangled sob escaped her lips. The chasm between his perception of her, his rock, his saint, and the squalid reality of her secret was suddenly too vast to bear. She couldn't speak. She could only shake her head, tears streaming down her face, pulling her hand away from his as if his touch were fire. The look of confusion and hurt that dawned on Michael's face was the most painful thing she had ever seen. The lie was over, and in its place, a terrible, devastating truth was about to be born. The confession was not a dramatic, shouting affair. It was a low, fractured conversation held in the pristine living room, the welcome home banner still hanging mockingly over the fireplace. Olivia's words came out in ragged bursts, interspersed with tears of shame. She told him everything, leaving out only Ethan's name, reducing him to an anonymous someone, because she understood, as Chloe had said, that he was not the point. The point was the loneliness, the invisibility, the crack in their foundation that had been there for years, long before the accident. Michael sat in his armchair, his face pale, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, his knuckles white. The physical pain of his injuries seemed to recede, replaced by a deeper, quieter agony. When she was finished, the silence that fell was the loudest sound Olivia had ever heard. It was the sound of a life breaking. "I see," he said finally, his voice unnervingly calm. He didn't look at her. He looked at the floor, at the intricate pattern on the Persian rug they had bought on their honeymoon. "I need you to leave, Olivia." The words were spoken without anger, without malice. They were a statement of fact, a necessary surgical procedure. And in a strange way, they were a relief. The next few days were a blur of logistics. Olivia packed a single suitcase, her movements numb and robotic. She looked at her closet full of clothes, her shelves full of books, the easel in the spare room, and felt no connection to any of it. It all belonged to a woman she no longer was, and perhaps never had been. She found a small, furnished, one-bedroom apartment in a neighboring town, a place with no character and no history. It was anonymous and bleak, with beige walls and cheap laminate flooring. It was perfect. It was a blank canvas. The first weeks in the apartment were a free-fall. She cut off all contact with everyone except Chloe. She didn't answer texts from concerned friends in Maple Creek. She ignored Jessica's furious, heartbroken voicemails. Her world shrank to the four walls of her new, empty life. The silence here was different too. It wasn't curated or tense. It was just empty, a hollow vessel for her shame. Most days, she did nothing. She sat on the lumpy sofa and stared at the beige walls, the guilt of physical presence, a heavy ghost sitting beside her. It whispered to her in the quiet hours of the night, replaying every moment of her deceit, every trusting smile on Michael's face. She was drowning in it. Chloe, worried, gave her a number. "Her name is Dr. Hayes," she said. "She's good. Just go, Liv. You can't do this alone." Making the call was one of the hardest things she had ever done. Admitting she needed help felt like a final confirmation of her failure. But the thought of another day alone with the ghost in her apartment was even more terrifying. Dr. Evelyn Hayes was a calm, elegant woman in her late 50s with intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through Olivia's carefully constructed defenses. Her office was warm and inviting, filled with books and plants, a stark contrast to the sterility of Olivia's new life. In their first session, Olivia could barely speak. She just cried. Dr. Hayes let her, occasionally sliding the tissue box closer. "The guilt you're feeling is immense," Dr. Hayes said, her voice a gentle probe. "It's serving a purpose. It's punishing you. But guilt and responsibility are two different things. Guilt keeps you trapped in the past. Responsibility asks, what now?" Slowly, painstakingly, over weeks of sessions, Dr. Hayes helped Olivia untangle the knot of her emotions. She forced Olivia to look beyond the affair itself, to the years leading up to it. "Tell me about the woman who put her paintbrush down," Dr. Hayes prompted one day. Olivia talked about her art, about the vibrant, passionate person she had been. She talked about the slow, almost imperceptible process of subsuming her identity into Michael's. It wasn't his fault, she explained. He hadn't demanded it. She had offered it up, piece by piece, in the name of love and support and the shared goal of their perfect life, until there was nothing left for herself. "You were a ghost in your own home long before you became a ghost in that hospital," Dr. Hayes observed. The affair, it was a reckless, destructive way of trying to prove to yourself that you still existed, that someone could still see you. The insight was so sharp, so true, that it took Olivia's breath away. Ethan hadn't been a lover. He had been a mirror. He had reflected back to her a version of herself she thought was long dead. The realization didn't excuse her actions, but it contextualized them. It shifted the narrative from, "I am a horrible person," to, "I was a person in unbearable pain who made a horrible choice." It was a subtle but profound shift, the first crack of light in her dark prison of self-loathing. On Dr. Hayes' advice, Olivia bought a cheap set of paints and a canvas. For days, it sat in the corner of her apartment, accusing her. She was afraid to touch it. What if there was nothing left inside? What if the artist was truly gone? One rainy afternoon, driven by a despair so deep it felt like an engine, she tore the plastic off the canvas and squeezed black paint onto a paper plate. She didn't think, she just moved. Her hand, at first clumsy and hesitant, began to fly across the canvas. She painted the oppressive, sterile white of the hospital, the bruised purple of the stormy sky, the blinding glare of fluorescent lights. It was a messy, chaotic, ugly painting. It was a painting of her guilt. When she was finished, she was exhausted, her hands and clothes smeared with black paint. She stepped back and looked at it. And for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something other than shame. She felt relief. She had taken the ugliness inside her and put it outside of herself. It was still there, but it was no longer consuming her from within. Autumn bled into a cold, stark winter. Olivia painted. She filled her small apartment with canvases, each one a step in her emotional excavation. She painted the suffocating silence of her old house, the desperate hope of a wilting petunia, the ghost of her reflection in a rain-streaked car window. Her art wasn't pretty. It was raw, honest, and painful. It was her. She established a routine. She woke up, drank coffee, painted for hours, and took long walks through the anonymous streets of her new town. She started taking small freelance design jobs again, but this time she was more selective, choosing projects that allowed for a sliver of creativity. She was building a life, a small and fragile one, from the wreckage of her old one. She and Michael had communicated only through lawyers. The divorce was proceeding quietly. She asked for nothing, wanting only to sever the ties cleanly. But one day in early spring, an email from him appeared in her inbox. The subject line was simply, "Hello." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened it. "Olivia, I hope you are doing okay. My recovery is going well. I'm walking without a cane now. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I was wondering if you would be willing to meet for coffee. I think we need to talk, just once, without lawyers. Michael." She met him at a neutral coffee shop, halfway between her apartment and their old house. He was already there when she arrived, sitting at a small table by the window. He looked thinner, and there was a new gravity in his face. but the scar on his temple was the only remnant of the accident. The awkwardness between them was a palpable thing. They ordered coffee and sat in a silence that echoed with years of shared history and the deafening boom of its collapse. He spoke first. "I'm not here to yell at you," he said, his voice quiet. "I did a lot of that, by myself, in that empty house. And then I got tired of it." He looked at her, his gaze clear and direct, but different than before. The blind adoration was gone, replaced by a sad, weary knowing. "I spent months being angry at you," he continued, "and I had every right to be. What you did it was a profound betrayal. But after the anger, I just had a lot of time to think about the years before the accident, about how I'd come home and you'd ask about my day, but I never really asked about yours. Not really. I just assumed you were happy because the house was perfect and dinner was ready and our life looked the way it was supposed to." He paused, stirring his coffee. "I was a passenger in our life together, and I left you to do all the driving. I see that now. I didn't see you live, not the way I should have." Tears streamed silently down Olivia's face. It wasn't absolution, but it was something far more valuable. Acknowledgement. "It doesn't excuse what I did," she whispered. "Nothing does. I was lost, and I destroyed everything because I didn't know how to ask for help. I'm so sorry, Michael, for the pain I caused you. It's a weight I will carry forever." "I know," he said. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. He slid it across the table. Jessica was clearing out the spare room to make it into a proper guest room. She found this. Olivia opened it. Inside were sketches, dozens of them, old charcoal drawings she had done in college, full of life and movement, designs for art prints she had dreamed up years ago. At the bottom of the pile was a half-finished painting on a small canvas board, a portrait of a woman's face, half in shadow, half in light. A self-portrait she had abandoned. "I never threw them away," she said, her voice thick. "I know," he repeated softly. "Are you painting again?" She nodded. "Yes." "Good," he said, and for the first time, a genuine, gentle smile touched his lips. "That's good to hear." They talked for another hour, not about reconciliation, but about their separate futures. He was selling the house. It was too big, too full of ghosts. He was thinking of moving into the city, closer to his firm. He was starting over. When they parted ways outside the coffee shop, there was no hug, no touching, just a look of mutual, sorrowful understanding. "Take care of yourself, Olivia," he said. "You too, Michael." Driving back to her apartment, Olivia felt a profound sense of peace settle over her for the first time. The weight of her guilt was still there, but it no longer threatened to crush her. It had become a part of her story, a dark, heavy stone in her pocket that would always remind her of the cost of losing oneself. She unlocked the door to her apartment. The scent of turpentine and oil paint filled the air. Canvases, finished and in progress, lined the walls. In the center of the room, on her easel, was her latest work. It was a simple painting of her window, looking out onto the ordinary street below. The light in the painting was soft, tentative, the light of early morning. It wasn't the bold, dramatic art of her youth, nor the dark, chaotic art of her initial breakdown. It was quiet. It was calm. It was hopeful. She walked over to it, picked up a brush, and added a touch of pale yellow to the sky. The future was a blank canvas, an uncertainty that once would have terrified her. But now, she was the one holding the brush. And for the first time, in a very long time, she was not afraid. The quiet hum in her apartment was no longer the sound of emptiness. It was the sound of a life, her life, beginning.